We have a panel of 5 fantastic speakers here and only an hour and a half in which to address one of the biggest and most fashionable topics around big data. And I'd just like to say, in a hipsterist fashion, everybody's talking about big data now, but the Battle of Ideas 2 years ago, we were talking about how statistics was the next sexy thing. People scoffed, and now we are proved right. That's all I'm saying. So, big data. The name of the session, I think, reveals what's going on here, because it's called Number Crunching and Ethics in the Era of Big Data, which shows that really the debate spans the whole spectrum from the really raw, if you like, mathematical coalface of big data, which we started to explore in the last session on computer modelling, where it really does consist of trillions and trillions of ones and zeros, essentially, being crunched in increasingly large computers. But at the other end, we have the very human side. We're often the human subjects of big data, and we're certainly at the receiving end of decisions, ideas, and policies made as a result of big data. So even if you thought you weren't particularly interested in statistics as a discipline, you clearly, the fact that you're all here reveals you've recognised that big data is an important discussion to the way we make all sorts of decisions in modern society. So I'm not going to keep going on because we have 5 great speakers and I don't want to eat into their time too much. I'm going to introduce them all in the order in which they're going to speak. They've been asked to prepare 5 to 7 minutes, which is very brief, and then we may have a little discussion between us, and then I will come out to you so you can all make your points and ask your questions. And what I will do when I come out to you is take 4 or 5 points at a time and then come back to the panel to maximise the amount of interaction we can have. I should also remind you all as well, we're being filmed for World Bites, so if you've snuck out to this session on big data pretending you were having a rendezvous with a secret lover or something, then when you make your point from the floor, just keep sitting down and nobody will be able to see you. But otherwise, when you make your point from the floor, please stand up so that we can see you. Okay, so to our speakers, on my extreme left here, we have Dr. Martin Thomas, who's worked in computing since he graduated as a biochemist in 1969. In 1983, he founded Praxis, a software engineering company. He's the Vice President for External Affairs at the Royal Academy of Engineering and chairs the IT policy panel for the IET. And I should say, like all of our speakers, his biography spans far more than that, but if I read all of their biographies out in full, that would be our hour and a half up. So you'll have to look it up on the website. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Tim Hubbard, who's on my immediate right, who's Senior Group Leader at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute and was one of the organisers of the sequencing of the human genome. So if that's not a big data project, I don't know what is. He's also now a member of the cross-funding agency Expert Advisory Board on Data Access, and many other things. And this year, he was seconded part-time to NHS England as the specialist advisor for the project to sequence 100,000 genomes. So that's the scale on which we're escalating. At the far end over there, we have Sandy Starr, who is one of the people who's helped put this strand of events together. He's Communications Officer at the Progress Educational Trust, a charity that works in genetics, assisted conception, embryo and stem cell research and related areas. Among many other things that he's done, he's written for publications including Tech Central Station, Open Democracy, Times Higher Education, and been film reviewer for The Sun. And he's contributed chapters to books including Crime and Deviance in Cyberspace, the Media Freedom Internet Cookbook, and the Internet Brave New World. Next on my immediate left, glad to welcome him back. He spoke at the statistics session 2 years ago. Brian Joseph is a partner in the Actuarial and Insurance Management Solutions practice of PwC in the UK, specialising in property and casualty insurance. He's a member of the firm's Global Insurance Leadership Team. He's also a Fellow of the Institute of Actuaries, Fellow of the Society of Actuaries in Ireland, and a member of the American Academy of Actuaries. As you guessed, he's an actuary. And finally, on my right here is Christine Rosen, who some of you may have already seen speak at yesterday's opening session. She's a Fellow at the New America Foundation, where she writes about the intersection of technology and culture. She's written a lot about bioethics and focused on the history of the eugenics movement and genetic science, and is one of the founding editors of the New Atlantis. So they're going to attempt to distill the massive subject of big data into 5 to 7 minute introductions. So Martin, would you like to start us off?
Good morning. I want to focus on big data about people, not the big scientific data from the Large Hadron Collider and that sort of thing. That's much less controversial, I think. I want to talk about the big data that comes from government departments, from the Department of Health, or from big business, places like Google and so on, and from sensors around the environment. And there's no doubt that big data and data analysis can be very beneficial to society in terms of healthcare, public health improvement, in terms of law enforcement, just to take a couple of examples. But there are two big problems with big data, in my opinion. The first big problem is that big data can lead to bad policy, and the second one is the privacy issue. And I'll deal with each in turn, starting with the bad policy problem. And the bad policy problem is that selection bias is a real issue when you're handling big data. For example, if you're processing online data, then you are systematically excluding the 25% of the population who don't use the internet. And that 25% of the population are not exclusively, but in the main, poorer and older. And so policy based on that data is likely to be biased fairly heavily away from those groups, which may be beneficial to some political leanings and less beneficial to others, perhaps. Similarly, if you use NHS data, you're largely missing the lifestyle data for healthy people. And that can be a public health problem if what you're trying to do is to come up with data which will help people to avoid particular illnesses, because you'll miss the characteristics of healthy people's lifestyles that are potentially beneficial, whilst focusing on the things that are in unhealthy people's lifestyles, some of which may be causally related to the problems they're facing and many of which will not. But the big data analysis will help you distinguish between those. That's fine. But you are missing out the healthy population, or a large part of their lifestyles. So using big data to avoid doing properly controlled longitudinal studies is a bad idea. It's lazy, it's cheap, and obviously very attractive, but it does carry risks, and those risks need to be addressed in some way. Moving to the privacy problem, even simple data sets, things like search histories or a database of your Facebook likes or your store card data, can reveal large amounts of personal information about you. For example, you can, with reasonably high certainty, determine the colour of your skin from your Facebook likes and your store card, or your store card data. You don't need both. You can pick up your sexual preferences, your religion, your political leanings, and even whether you're pregnant or not. In a number of circumstances, even perhaps before you know that you're pregnant yourself, it will show up in the behaviour that is reflected in your store card data. There have been some particularly notorious examples of that fairly recently. Now, you often hear people say, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. But during this debate, I want to convince you that that phrase is unthinking, ignorant, and callous. It's unthinking and callous because it implies that there's something wrong in having something to hide. And many people have honest reasons to need privacy. You may have a medical condition that could trigger prejudice that you want to avoid, such as HIV/AIDS or mental illness. You may have deeply personal traumas somewhere in your past that are really nobody else's business and which you don't want to be reminded of or to discuss. You may be escaping an abusive relationship, and it may be important to your health and safety that your location isn't able to be found by your abusive partner. You may be protecting adopted children from the birth family that abused them, which is why they were adopted. You may be on witness protection. You may be trying to avoid religious prejudices, and many, many, many other reasons why perfectly respectable, reasonable, honest people have something to hide. And you may very well be in that category either now or later. And if privacy isn't the social norm, then people who are trying to remain private stand out. So it's unthinking and callous not to help those people to be private when they need to be. It's unthinking and ignorant because data lasts and circumstances change. Do you want you or your children to be denied or delayed hospital treatment because your store card data at some time in the future shows that you lived an unhealthy lifestyle? Or are you prepared to risk not getting a mortgage or some form of racial prejudice because your Facebook likes have revealed the colour of your skin to somebody who decides that they're going to act on that? And how would you know when the algorithms that are processing the data are not published and you won't be told about them? Don't be tricked by being told that anonymized data makes it safe, because computer scientists know that it is very easy to re-identify personal data by comparing supposedly anonymized data with other available data sets. So anyone who says that you don't have to worry because the data has been anonymized is either ignorant or a liar, and unfortunately, quite often both. I conclude that to get the benefits of big data, personal data must be under the individual's control and properly regulated. That's not true in the UK. The Data Protection Act is inadequate. It doesn't properly implement the European Data Protection Directive. There aren't strong penalties because the Act to increase the penalties was passed by Parliament, but the government has refused to bring those stronger penalties into force, even though the Information Commissioner has asked them to do so. So there's a risk that we're going to lose the benefits of big data through poor regulation and yet suffer the worst consequences. And I hope that the debate here will help us to argue more strongly that we need to do something about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent start. And fine timekeeping. Right, so Dr. Tim Hubbard, you use big data. I'm afraid you're going to be disappointingly nuanced. I hope to set you up as an extreme big data fan, but I know you're going to give us a much more nuanced and interesting introduction.
Okay, for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about health data, which is very relevant to the previous speaker. So from my direction, I've of course come from the genomics world, and we're really into big data because of the rate at which data can be generated has changed. So the first human genome, only in 2001, cost about £1 billion. Nowadays, you can get one for £2,000 or £3,000. That's an amazing drop in price and a corresponding increase in data generation. The first thing, we collected data for a number of years around the world with huge factories. Now you can get your genome done on a single machine in 27 hours. That's how fast things have come. And that's why we've gone from 1 genome to 1,000 Genomes project, led jointly with the Sanger Institute, the UK 10K project, which is around a set of cohorts, the ALSBAC and 20 UK cohorts. And now we're planning the 100,000 Genomes project in the NHS for treatment of individuals. So it's just the rate of growth like that. So that data, we're kind of moving towards, we've gone from a research project where we're just interested in, how does the genome work, to actually looking at individuals' genomes and trying to, predict from that useful things, outcomes, which drugs you should take to improve your health, things you maybe should be warned about of high risks of cancer, things like that. Now that leads a lot of this analysis. We don't understand that much about the genome yet. A lot of the analysis is going to come from seeing lots and lots of genomes together, seeing patterns in those genomes and relating those to people's health as they are now. And so that's where you get this linkage between the genome and what's in the health records. That's where this huge value is in terms of improving things and why it's useful to do kind of collection of data in the NHS, both to drive individual treatments, but also improve the amount of data that we can know collectively and then apply back to those individual treatments. And then, of course, this collides with the privacy question. So I've been living in a completely open data world at the Sanger Institute where we have released data famously during the genome wars of 2000, where a company tried to own the human genome. We've been releasing it within 24 hours so researchers can benefit. And you've seen an amazing amount of research that's gone on across the world because that data was just downloadable, easy to use. Now, with our thousands of genomes which are connected to individuals, there's the real question of privacy and how to handle that. So what do? So the previous speaker talked about the problems of anonymity. Actually, your genome by itself is pretty anonymous because I can't work out from that genome who anybody is. It's only when I link it to something else that I have that additional information that might make that possible. So I think this is recognized as a problem. And there's been this new report, Caldecott 2, looking at this. And in fact, really the collision of 2 points. Firstly, the data's very big. And the data being big means that actually downloading it isn't so easy anymore. In fact, it's just not practical. We managed to, when we did the 1,000 Genomes project, we actually saturated the connection between the UK and the US when we synchronized this data between the databases. Completely saturated it. As you get up to the higher volumes, you're just not, network speed is not going up anything like fast enough to move this stuff around. So it becomes natural to think, well, actually, you keep the data in one place and you move the compute to it. And you can take that a step further and say, well, actually, I'm actually going to put the data behind a locked wall, and I'm going to put the compute inside that wall, and I'm only going to run things which are certified to run. And I'm not going to export any of the raw data. I'm only going to export the statistics, because that's actually what researchers are interested in. They're not interested in the individual records. They want them to be linked together because then you can see patterns, but they want to see the statistical output. So this is the idea of safe havens, where you don't distribute the data. So the way it was described, actually, if you look on the web, it's not in the sort of longer summary of this session, implying the risks that data gets collected and then distributed, and then you never know exactly what's going to happen to it. If it stays in a safe haven, actually you know exactly what's happened to it because you've seen what people have computed on it. You can track all that. You can track what software they brought in. You can track what statistics went out. You can be really strict about that. And I think that kind of structure does offer a way where we can have the best of both worlds. We can have privacy information, but we can allow research to happen in a fairly unrestricted way. In some ways, for the researchers, it's slightly harder. It's always easier if you've got the data on your laptop with you, but we have to make this compromise to preserve privacy, and it's a practical compromise to be able to, in the world of virtual machines, to run complicated algorithms against data inside a closed wall and get statistical outputs. So I think that's the way forward. And when the privacy, there has been a sort of period of evaluation about privacy, with Caldecott 2 and other sort of reports. I think there's a recognition in government actually that we've probably been too paranoid about privacy, and that has put huge barriers in the place of doing research. We've seen the benefits of openness for things like the human genome, just how fast people can move if they can really freely compute over data. So we have to be careful that we don't what does a release of privacy mean? That people have talked about what the damage it does, but there's the other side, the damage that you get if you don't do the research to look for new medicines or improvements of individual health. There's lots of potential for doing analysis and finding ways to personalize medicine and improve everybody's health from that type of analysis. If it gets blocked or just made too difficult, you're just going to lose that benefit. And if you quantify that benefit with the loss from privacy, I think you'd be losing more just at the protection of a degree of privacy that maybe isn't always necessary. In fact, there are people on the completely other side of the camp who are actually saying, well, actually, I don't really care about my health privacy. I'm going to have myself sequenced, and I'm going to put my health records online. I'm not going to put my name, but I'm not really going to care about anonymity. So that's the Public Genome Project in the US, which has actually got quite a sizable number of people signed up in that way. So there is a group that is saying, actually, this is not so critical. And at least for us, for a small group who decide to sign themselves up, and that's going to provide at least a significant group of open data, which isn't restricted in any way at all. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Data people are obviously brilliant. You tell them the exact number of minutes, that's what you get. Let's see what happens when we go over to Sandy. Sandy.
So when it comes to big data, I think there are two basic questions that confront us. The one that usually gets discussed is whether and in what sense the claims made for the significance of big data are true. Will big data revolutionize various fields of human endeavor? Are the hopes and the fears, such as we've just heard from our contrasting speakers, are those hopes and fears well-founded? And the second question, which I don't think is given enough attention, is why we want big data to have the revolutionary significance that's routinely ascribed to it. Why are we hungry for this development? Why are we apprehensive about this development? And what does the narrative that's being woven around the subject of big data tell us about ourselves? And the first question is very interesting, but the second question is, if anything, even more interesting. And I'll just look at both of them briefly. So on the question of whether the claims made for the significance of big data are true, in my view, when discussion of big data isn't just a restatement of established trends or common sense in mystifying terms, which it often is, what's really being talked about more often than not is an incredibly and unprecedentedly efficient way of picking the low-hanging fruit of knowledge. Because turning data into knowledge requires conscious human work. People have traditionally talked about a hierarchy with data at the bottom, information in the middle, and knowledge at the top. If the conversion of data to knowledge can be outsourced to an extent to automated tools, then I'd argue that what you're picking is by definition low-hanging fruit, which isn't as much of an insult as it might sound like, and it certainly doesn't mean that all of the fears about big data are ill-founded. Martin's points are well taken, and he's written an excellent piece in the Health Service Journal that's worth reading on this subject. We're absolutely surrounded by this low-hanging fruit. We're generating vaster and vaster quantities of data in a form that can be readily collected and aggregated and analysed. And its very ubiquity means that whether as individuals or as institutions, we sometimes struggle to perceive that it exists, much less make useful sense of it and exploit it to the full. So I think it makes complete sense that we're devising tools that can go through this stuff efficiently and disinterestedly, pick out patterns that might have meaning for us that we would otherwise be obscured from our view, and extract various forms of value from large quantities of data. What's valuable to me and to Google and to the government might not be the same thing. There's a legitimate debate to be had about those different types of value and which ones are legitimate. That said, it's very excited, but in my metaphor, as in agriculture, the low-hanging fruit may be abundant, but they are not the best fruit. That is to be found further up the tree. On my second question, why we're so keen for big data to deliver, I think there are some really clear themes that emerge from the narrative around it. And I don't think they always cast humanity in a great light. And for that reason, I don't think they always cast the cheerleaders or the advocates of big data in a great light. They can express a rather dim view of us. And One predominant theme of the big data narrative, and it's all over the popularization of big data, the best-selling book by Victor Meyer-Schönberger and Kenneth Cukier, is the idea of quantity becoming quality. They say this idea over and over again in different formulations. They say, the change of scale has led to a change of state. The quantitative change has led to a qualitative one. By changing the amount, we change the essence. I don't think it's a completely illegitimate idea. Actually, the idea of a transition from quantity into quality is a very rich one, philosophically speaking. It goes back at least as far as the philosophy of Hegel. I think there are two problems with it as it's invoked in relation to big data. The first is the reason why this supposed transition from quantity into quality resonates now, which I think is often due to something quite unedifying, which is a disavowal of human agency, a tendency not to want to believe that humans are consciously in the driving seat, or not wanting them to be consciously in the driving seat, and telling us that this having a more passive relationship to the world, apprehending the world in a more passive way. Meyer-Schönberger and Cukier put it as follows. They say the data can reveal secrets to those with the humility and the willingness and the tools to listen, and humility is a recurring theme. If you look at people throughout history who have been preoccupied with the idea of a transition from quantity into quality, people like Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, they weren't very big on the idea of humility. And they certainly weren't keen on humans vacating the driving seat or deferring sort of passively to a way of apprehending the world. Another problem related to the first, and I'll conclude with this, is that what's actually being talked about here is the opposite of what's claimed more often than not. It's a transition from quality into quantity, in as much as the quality of being a conscious human being possessed of agency and freedom and the various qualities that constitute your character and your personhood. We're being told that this is qualitative. This qualitative stuff can and should be rendered into quantitative stuff, and this should explain us and form the basis for our endeavours and the way we organise the world. It's a foreclosure. And what really worries me is not the bigness of the data, it's the narrowness of the vision.
Thank you, Sandy. Excellent. Not the bigness of the data, the narrowness of the vision. So, Brian.
Thanks. I start from the position of there is no such thing as big data. There's just data. Yeah. We have had data throughout all of our generations of life. It's now we are talking about the ability to process it digital. So what we are talking about is a revolution from being in an analog world where data was stored in big volumes, it was stored all over the place, into a digital world where data is now electronic, it's searchable, it's linkable, and people can investigate it. But it is still data. Yeah? Looking out there, my first point has to be there's no such thing as a free lunch. We sit in a world where we give away our data in exchange for services. So for the Googles of this world and for the Facebooks of this world, they have costs, they have businesses to run, and what they do is they offer us a service in exchange for our data, which they use to analyze and to make money from. We naively think that this is a free lunch because we think this should be free, we could organize our social lives, we can do anything we want. Well, I did a little bit of research just to try and find out how many servers these people have. And this is not public information, but obviously on the internet, everybody guesses everything. And in 2010, they were referring to Facebook having somewhere in the region of 900,000 servers. Now, if we were to assign a $100 price per server, that's 90 million. So therefore, they are providing things, and that's just hardware costs. We're not talking about software costs. We're not talking about programming costs. They're not talking about resilience costs. And this means that they are getting from us something which is worth more than they are paying out. And if you look at their share price, that's what it says. Now, these contracts are sometimes referred to as immoral, and I will just think back to when Apple, of course, just upgraded its system from iOS 6 to iOS 7, and they faced me with a 33-page contract, which said, you need to click here to accept the contract, but there are 33 pages in it. I made it to about page 5, and I am a geek. Life was just too short to go for the other 28 pages. So I did click accept, but realistically speaking, what they could have done, and from a moral point of view, is to say, and this is where the last contract that you clicked on without reading has changed. And I'd have read that bit. But, you know, there is a real debate to be had about how people inform us about the information. But we should just get used to it. Unless we're going to come off of the grid, the data will continue to exist. And why I say that data has always existed and ethics and morality has always played some form and part of it. I mean, most of you have never heard of Henrietta Lacks. Well, Henrietta Lacks lived in about the 50s. Well, any doctor would. Any doctor would. Any doctor would. But her cells did something which most human cells up to that time couldn't do. Her cells survived in a culture and could be analyzed and maintained. And indeed, the HLA strain of cells is still going on, still active. Now, Henrietta Lacks died. Her family did not know that her cells were harvested, her cells were maintained, and they were responsible for a lot of developments. You know, the testing of vaccines in relation to polio, etc. They were all tested on the HLA strain. Currently, many doctors are using the HLA strain to test things. And only in about the late 70s, early 80s, a little journalist went along and saw her family and started having conversations about, do you know that her cells are still living? Now, that confused a lot of the people that they were telling this story to. But ethically, they harvested her cells. And I remember just a number of years ago, we were in moral angst in the UK over the harvesting of cells of children and body parts of children around all the Hayes scandal, etc. But what they have done by using her cells in the way that they did may not be ethically and morally correct. But what it did was it saved lives. So that's the use of data, that's the use of a trait, that's the use. And it has been going on. We could go on for quite a while as to various ways in which the governments, etc., have used data. The third element that I'll just like to say is we should not be afraid of data and information. It is out there. We should accept it's out there. And what we really should be discussing is how we formulate a contract between ourselves and the people who will use it. Now, the visible people will use it. The invisible people, the security services, etc., I don't really believe we have any influence over them. And if anybody were to tell you differently, I will suggest that they will continue to investigate the data and the records which are out there in the best way possible, because they will lie. They will say, oh yes, we're not doing this, but they will continue to do it because it is there, it is available. And one last point and one story which just came up last week was the case of the little girl who went missing in Portugal. When I read that story, all it told me was 6 years ago, they collected all of the information, all of the phone calls made, and all the text messages sent in a little village in Portugal, elsewhere, and they were able to analyze these things. That's what it said to me. So just think, if you think about it, the information is there, people will analyze it, they will do things with it, and however we try to prevent that contract being broken, we should still look and say that, ladies and gentlemen, data is data. We use it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, throwing in some very hot and controversial examples there. Okay, so for the last word from the panel, Christine.
I hope you'll indulge me a little bit. I'm going to get slightly existential, which is always dangerous territory for an American. But I want to start by saying I think the first thing we should acknowledge, and Sandy touched on this, is that people hate uncertainty. So what big data is promising us is a degree of certainty that we never have had before. And I actually disagree with the claim that big data is just data. I think it is, because of its scalability, quite a different beast than just the sort of statistical world that existed in previous centuries. But I also agree with Sandy, more is not always better. So if we think about big data and what it promises to tell us, we forget a very important distinction, which is that big data can tell us that something happened. A certain number of people, bought a certain number of products. It can't necessarily tell us why it happened. This is the information versus knowledge distinction. But what's curious about the big data universe, and especially the purveyors of big data, the Googles and the Amazons, and I guess we should include the NSA in this in the United States as well, is that they don't really care why things happen. They just need the information about it happening. One of the favorite examples used by big data advocates is the Google flu trends research. Does everybody know about this? Google tracks search queries and locates them by region, then tries to make predictions about where influenza epidemics are going to hit and how serious they'll be. The CDC in the US actually consults Google flu trends as part of its own projections about flu season, but Google's often been very wrong about these trends. And I think that speaks to this issue of why we think it can tell us why something is happening. So in certain areas in the United States, people are searching for flu symptoms, but that could be for a number of reasons, right? They could have had their office mate sneeze in the flu next to them and they're hypochondriacal, and so they go straight to Google and they try to find out if they have the flu. The data gives us a point. It doesn't give us knowledge about that point. And now the existential bit. I don't think there's a phrase that we're not talking about here enough, and that's free will. So if you look at one of the things that big data wants to do in the future, it's make projections about future human behavior. It doesn't just want to tell us what we're doing in real time. It wants to predict what we'll do in the future. In the United States, this is already actively in use in terms of policing. So we have predictive policing modeling going on in communities across the United States. What this means is that you can use these algorithms, and again, you're right, they're proprietary, they're not open to public scrutiny. Algorithms are used to determine which street corner on a Saturday night is going to be more likely to have a shooting or some sort of violent act or something needing police intervention. And so I think, again, as a public safety issue, people love to hear this. They think, great, they'll be able to warn us not to go to this Safeway on Friday at 3 o'clock because all the school kids come out and get in fights together, and so I'll avoid that. But we're also making a judgment about what it means to be human. And we're taking a certain kind of inevitability mindset. And what that means is that you can't be responsible for what's inevitable, right? So the other area of policing that this is coming out in is parole. So parole boards across the United States are now using predictive big data modeling to determine whether someone is a risk for a violent act when they're paroled from prison. We have a very large prison population, so we're talking about a lot of people if this model starts to gain traction. It has really impressive results. So one of the parole boards had around 70-75% success rate in predicting whether someone would commit a violent or criminal act on parole. But that's still, you're still going to be preventing a certain number of real-life human beings from being paroled because a model said that they're likely to commit an act. They don't have the choice themselves if the model is preventing them from being paroled because it's been 70-75% successful with everyone else. So again, as an American, I'm highly individualistic, and I find this deeply offensive that we are going to be moving towards some of these models, again, in the interest of certainty, safety, avoidance of risk, all very popular notions these days. And I think it's also worth mentioning that big data doesn't just tell us what we're doing, it tells us what we should be doing. And this is, I think, where the health data becomes very important. And whether you can link certain sorts of personal consumer choices to what it means to be a healthy human being. We've had a recent scandal in the United States at Penn State University, where the new health plan that was given to faculty members required them to register and log, sort of how many steps they took in a day and certain other healthy lifestyle choices. Now, you could opt out. They said, this is, if you don't want to do that, that's fine, but you'll pay $100 more a month for your health insurance plan. So again, you see a carrot, but there's a huge stick looming in the background of a lot of these big data plans. I want to end by going back to the privacy question. And I want to make a fairly bold claim, and hopefully I can back it up, or some of you will help me in the discussion. Our old notions of privacy no longer can apply when it comes to big data, and that's for 3 reasons. The idea of notice and consent can't apply. You can't, because most of what big data is used for is second-order use. That is, you might consent to Google to check the box and say, yeah, I agree, I'm giving you this information. But second, third, fourth uses, other parties will then use that data later, sometimes for future uses that we don't even know yet. So notice and consent doesn't work anymore. Opting out doesn't really work anymore, because often this data is being gathered without your knowledge to begin with. And also because you can't anonymize this, and this is something that was mentioned by Martin at the beginning. I'll end with an interesting little case that happened recently in the US. Do you guys know what Netflix is? The video streaming service. Okay, so Netflix has this terrible recommendation engine. It's an embarrassment. I mean, Amazon's wonderful. Netflix is like, a Model T Ford compared to a Porsche. I mean, it's just awful. So they had this Netflix contest, and they said, we're going to give $1 million to anyone who can help us with this algorithm, because we're stumbling here. So they did a big data dump of about 100 million rental records, all anonymized, and they said, go for it, fix this problem for us. Well, so computer engineers and scientists, being what they are, said, oh, that's really interesting. Let's see if we can figure out an individual rental, someone's profile on Netflix with this anonymized data. It didn't take them long. What it led to, besides several lawsuits now pending against Netflix, was the revelation, for example, of a closeted lesbian in the Midwest who had been posting anonymous reviews on Netflix of lesbian films, but also on imdb.com, another website. And it didn't take long to figure out these cross posts and then track down from available public information who she was and to publicly identify her. And there are numerous cases like this that have gone on, and I'm sure here in the UK as well. So I want to end by suggesting provocatively we have to toss all of our notions of privacy when it comes to big data and start at the beginning and think through what that might look like.
Thank you very much, Christine. Fantastic, and you have all kept admirably to time. So I'm going to take the opportunity to throw a few ideas about amongst the people on the panel first before we go out. We will come out soon. So there seem to be 2 main themes emerging here. One of them is the privacy one, which obviously has been discussed elsewhere this weekend as well, and the difficulty in making data truly anonymous and yet being able to use it for purposes which could make really significant benefits to all of us. So I'd like to put that on one side for a second, because I'm sure we will come back to it in the discussion, and look at the other slightly more, as you said, existential question, which is, does treating us as data points in some way change the way we think about ourselves as human beings? Do we start to have a more deterministic idea of who we are, and does it erode our sense of responsibility for our own thoughts and actions if we start looking at ourselves through the tools of big data? Would anyone like to give me your comments on that? I am kind of looking at you, Martin, you're right.
Yes, I noticed that.
I say anyone, I mean you.
I noticed that. I'm not sure that it directly, as a sort of first reaction, causes people to think differently about themselves, because I think that's a second-order effect. What it does is change the environment in which people are able to operate. As Christine was saying, the processing of data, and in particular the use of predictive algorithms, can actually constrain your freedom of movement in the future in all kinds of ways, either by nudging you in a particular direction or by keeping you banged up in jail when you really ought to be out on parole, to take two real extremes. And the constraints that the environment places on how you can behave will in turn obviously start to affect your view of what you are as an autonomous agent. So that brings it back to the point that you were making, that yes, it does have that effect, but not as a first stage, because it's changed the environment in which you're living.
Did you want to come back on that one, Tim? I know you mentioned that sort of side of it, and then you focused very much on the privacy side.
I think that, so when we're looking at health, we're trying to move towards personalised medicine. Of course, at the moment, it's really stratified medicine. We're saying, well, here's a group, we can identify these statistically, and we can put you in this group, and then we'll offer something like, maybe we'll give you an early cancer test because you're in this group which has a higher risk. Well, doesn't really get in the way of yourself that much. I mean, it's a fairly minor, and I think we're at that kind of level because we realise we can't do much else. And remember, we're in a socialised health system here. We're looking at cost-benefit analysis. We're not going to offer huge numbers of extra tests based on some poor predictive measure. We're only going to offer them where there's solid enough data to say that it's going to improve collectively a group of people's health. And if it means we offer less tests in some areas, that'll be a saving as well, which will allow us to improve things elsewhere and spend more money elsewhere. So I don't think it interferes with a person's individual free will very much by doing this.
Could I jump in with just one remark on that, which is, but in the genetic context, which obviously you know better than I do, it can, right? I mean, so in the United States, we have very much a consumer-oriented free market in genetic testing. There's a company called 23andMe that was founded by one of the wives of the founders of Google. You send in, cheek swabs, and they run your genome and tell you risks based on wildly ridiculous statistics, but that's another issue. But what about the right not to know? So on the cost-benefit analysis, I agree, but there are certain conditions that some people, it will change how they live their lives if they know, and it will change it if they don't know. If you have, early onset dementia gene, or you have, ALS, there are people who choose not to find out because they want to maintain an open future.
So that's a debate at the moment about that, the way that 100,000 is going to be applied is people who have particular conditions already, they're in the health system, either rare diseases or cancer. The test is to help improve their particular treatment in those areas. Now, of course, that may throw up some other things. What are you going to return? Are you going to tell them about some other things? There's been this report in the States about that there's 50 things that maybe you should report back because they're sufficiently strong if you see them that you'd really want to know. But there is, actually with the 23andMe example, you get back your results, but there's a few things where they say, we could give you this additional information about your Alzheimer's status. Do you want to know? And you can actually decide if you want to know or not. And I think we'll move towards that kind of framing. This kind of actually fits in with what's being planned in the UK Health Service, where a system's being built so you'll be able to access your own records, personally, directly, and potentially, add information yourself. This question about, I can't remember who said it, you said it, about not collecting information from the individual about their lifestyle. That will be potentially possible. But once you have that kind of interface, then there's also the potential to record, what do you want to know? Do you want to be told these things or not? So I think, data will be collected, but what it will be returned, that will become more personalizable and controllable by the individual. So that is the plan.
But
everyone wants to come in there.
There are two big issues with that, it seems to me. The first is that although an individual who finds out things about their genome may give consent, their entire family and relatives haven't, and you found out information about them as well.
That's exactly, and you have, there's clinical genetics groups in the NHS right now, and they deal with these issues through discussions about consent all the time.
I don't doubt it. I'm just nervous about whether the consequences lead to proper consent of the right group of people before actions are taken.
So,
okay, before this comes two-head argument, I can see Sandy dying to get in, and then I want to throw this back to you. Go on.
I am actually more with Tim on this. I'm fairly sanguine about incidental findings, and I'm open to notions of more generic types of consent rather than specific types of consent that make these sorts of projects possible. My concern about the genomics is a little like my concern about the big data. It's not what it can tell us, it's why we want it to tell us so much. And I think what's often misunderstood about determinism, especially nowadays, whether it's of the technological variety or the biological varieties, we think it's about an infatuation with the relevant technology or with the relevant aspects of biology, but it's not. It's because we're clinging to these things because we have some sort of blind spot. It's because we're blind to some dimension of ourselves. And we can only understand ourselves, talk about ourselves, think about ourselves in a way that we see as tractable in technical or natural scientific terms. That's what's the driver behind various forms of determinism bound up with big data and bound up with genomics. And it does actually come back to the privacy question. well, not privacy. You see, the distinction between privacy and data is quite important. The two things are related to each other, but they're not the same thing. You know, David Aronovich on a panel with Christine yesterday said, you are not your data. And I think he's quite correct. I think if your private life is reducible to data, then by definition, you have an impoverished private life. Right? And whilst other people can invade your privacy, to impoverish your privacy is something that is not done by outside agents alone. It's something we have a role in. And that's a very interesting set of dynamics, and I think we need to consider them.
Okay, I just wanted to throw a specific thing about, I mean, my impression of you, Brian, is that you're very relaxed about the fact that our data is going out there and that the idea that actually whether we give explicit consent or not, that's just the way the world is and we should relax and get on with it. Do you think that, I mean, in a sense, to flip Sandy's position on its head, that actually it's not that big a deal and there are huge benefits to be got from things like, you know, Henrietta Lacks I thought was a very interesting and quite provocative example because there was actually some controversy about the fact that her physical tissue had been taken and used for research. But in a sense, people are having similar discussions now about their information being taken and used for research. It's not obviously the same thing as taking something physical, but then, you know, maybe we should just relax about it all. Is that what you're kind of gently pushing us towards?
Well, yes. I think, I might be being very fatalistic about all of this, but I think that the genie is out of the bottle. It's just like if I go back to the 16th, 17th century when they invented printing. Now, before that, the monks had an absolute control on information, and indeed, society's information was quite locked into the heads and the systems of a few specific institutions. Printing came about, cheap. It started to be distributed out there. Ideas started to flow. People started to communicate. One-page newsletters started to be badly printed on kitchen tables. It started to get out. People started to formulate new thoughts, new ideas, develop in new ways. And what did the authorities do? They hated this. They tried to control it. They tried everything possible, but it didn't work. And where we are is we are now in a digital revolution. We've moved from the analog world into the digital world. And there are rules which will develop over time. And these rules will come into being, but, you know, I think we need to just recognize that unless we are going to throw away all the things which link us to the digital world now, we are where we are.
Okay, you get one more word and then I will go out to the audience.
So I don't think it's necessarily quite that bad because the things that I was talking about, the safe havens models, once you've got some system like that in place, you can control what people do with the data, and you can, as a society, potentially regulate that. We haven't had those systems available; they just weren't possible before. Data just moved around. This business about which contracts you sign, it's interesting. There's a kind of analogy with the free software movement. There's licenses which describe how you develop free software, and you kind of have an authority in the Free Software Foundation deciding which licenses are okay and which aren't. And there's actually a similar group which are you can add this plug into your browser, which will look at sites you go to and say, you know, have we looked at the policies of this site and are they okay or not? And it will give you sort of color code about, if they've looked at it, about what's wrong with the policy documents that you're signing up to, so you can be warned. So I think there's a potential to try and deal with this policy question about what's okay. You see this with the discussions around Facebook when they change the privacy. There's a storm if somebody's put something, you know, you may not look when you sign it up, but somebody will have looked and there will be a legal debate about whether this was an okay thing, and it gets reversed in some situations. So I wouldn't say it's hopeless, provided we don't all just relax and ignore it. If a few people take this seriously and get into it, then I think it's controllable.
I will just come back with one quick point on controllable. I think people hack into things.
You're uncontrollable.
Absolutely. People hack into
things.
things.
That's a different problem.
Okay, so as I said, I will take 4 or 5 points at a time. Please speak into the end of the microphone.
It seems to me that the science itself in this is neutral. The big data is neutral. It's got tremendously helpful things for us, and there's some negativities. But it seems to me the discussions about society and an increasingly besieged idea of the individual. And we've heard, I think, Sandy and Christine put that quite eloquently. And the Minority Report moment with parole is truly terrifying and just truly wrong. I mean, it's just wrong. But just looking at it from the other way round, I think also people who are nervous of big data, also at the heart of this, there's an idea of that diminished individual. And there's this idea that big data is going to come back at you by these kind of sinister, shadowy forces. Maybe the government, maybe what I've heard tech people call the gaffers, that's Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, these sinister forces, they're going to come back at you and you're going to be crushed and pinned as the individual by the data being somehow used against you. And I'm not sure that nervousness is helpful either. There are issues, but it's also about the individual and how we react with that. And I think Sandy's point about if you're just your data, you're a pretty impoverished individual is pretty damn right. From my own experience, I've got to say, Facebook, when they're using my data to send me those helpful adverts, don't know me. My data does not tell them who I am. They inevitably, because I'm a woman of a certain age, give me these damned adverts. I'm just not interested in them. I don't want a facelift, thank you very much. They get it wrong. They don't know me fully as a human individual, as a human individual agency. So I think there's a balance here, and I think that it's about society and the individual and what we're going to do with this for our good as society.
Thank you. Very good balancing point.
We heard some quite interesting points about the ability of big data to make predictions. I think Christine talked about how, like that?
Yeah.
Okay. How it could achieve much more accurate results in terms of parole predictability. And there was a hostility to that. But my question would be, if big data is able to predict and to model more accurately than humans can make decisions about these questions, would the panel still feel that humans should be allowed to make those decisions, even if they're less accurate in their predictions? And if so, why?
Well, I think that's a good point, because it is about prediction. I think that's the thing that's kind of gets lost, I think Christine made the point about causality and people like certainty. We really are talking about using enormous quantities of data to make predictions about things, but that doesn't remove the notions of free will that have been touched on. But then, see, that leads me, though, to respond, Sandy. You're saying, why do we want this data to show us something? And I get this feeling that you could flip it on its head and say, why are you scared of it? Why? You're in danger of sounding a bit Luddite, actually, I think, because... and sorry, Christine, too, because the... You're saying, look at Google. So take the flu example that you gave. You said, well, that doesn't tell us anything about the guy who sneezed in the cubicle next to you. But that's already the case with, masses of research and the whole scientific method and the way things have evolved, particularly in health, over the centuries, that you don't know anything about the specific reason this person had a headache or that person felt a bit wheezy, but you got the Black Death, and on aggregate, we can tell something about the population from this information. So we're talking about the ability to predict rather than the ability to tell us something about the individual. So the reason I say, Sandy, why are you scared of it is, it sounds to me like we're scared of sort of admitting that we are a data point. I am a data point at the same time. So, no, you are too, I'm afraid, because you mentioned Hegel, and this is exactly the realm we're in. We are both individuals, not we're both individuals, we are at one and the same time an individual and an abstract entity. We're an abstract kind of member of the human race. We are an individual with rights, this kind of abstract thing. And we're both. And you seem to be scared of being the one, the abstract. You seem to be saying, I don't want to be a data point, this abstract thing with, my mum wouldn't recognise me. You want to be the individual all the time. And somehow I think we've got to try and work out how we address both. Otherwise, we're not going to find our way through this.
My local shop doesn't need big data. I just tell him what he hasn't got and he goes and gets it if I'm really lucky. But a big organisation like Tesco's or Sainsbury's does, and it means they can have automated checkouts. And so the thing that I think is interesting about big data is that it allows for much more centralised organisation. And the same with the NSA, where fewer people can survey and a lot more, much bigger countries and many more people. It took 100,000 people in the Stasi to monitor the Eastern Germans. And now you can do it with a lot smaller people, a lot less people because of big data. So what are the implications are about centralised control?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether you're saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, but...
It's up to you. You've got to tell me.
Isn't this just an old-fashioned question of risk-benefit? I am a massive fan of free will, but you just don't have much when you've been given a diagnosis of Huntington's or terminal cancer. And I think, Tim, maybe you should spend a couple of minutes telling us about the benefits, which you didn't actually do, of the 100,000 Genome Project, because I think you should take up, Sandy, on the low-lying fruits. If actually there's all these risks that our first speaker talked about, which are pretty horrendous, with not much benefit in terms of the medical data, then let's not do it. But my understanding is it is much more exciting than this. And the risk that my mother might find out that I've got early Alzheimer's against the benefit of a potential cure for early Alzheimer's, to me, it's a no-brainer.
Great, thank you.
On the same theme, I watched my grandfather die of cancer with everybody refusing to tell him. It was insulting. Of course he knew. I've actually been the benefit of being treated like an adult. I found out at 24 that I have hereditary deafness, which meant I could choose to change my career while that was still possible, rather than getting disabled out of it. And then when I was 30, I found out I had a genetic disease, which, first of all, changed my life. And you mentioned, how does it affect family? Well, it did indeed ripple right the way back through my father's family, which means that's about 15 people no longer wondering why people are telling them they're hypochondriacs. And my much younger brother and sister, who, when they started to show symptoms at 12, did not go through the sheer misery of adolescence that I went through. We're grown-ups. I'm really lucky I have a GP who treats me like a grown-up. And when it comes to things like information, I'm sorry, the more information we have, the more we get to plan for our own futures. I have a 3-part plan, one of which is about none of my disabilities get worse, one is they end up moderate, and the other is that they get much more severe. I'm a grown-up. I have those choices.
Obviously, you can't all answer everything, so please pick the points that you'd like to answer. Sandy, you want to start us off?
Certainly. I'm not scared of big data. I'm suspicious of the enthusiasm for it. That's a slightly different thing. I'm sipped the Kool-Aid, and it tastes good in relation to the fact that aggregating data at a large scale can tell people they're pregnant or that they're going to get divorced before they know it, and they've decided it themselves. I'm very sanguine about businesses using that to sell us products. I'm slightly less sanguine about it being used for the allocation of public services and resources, and I'm very concerned about it being used to nudge us in relation to our health. But I recognise that the data can tell us things in that respect. I mean, obviously, yes, we are all individuals, we are all data points. A gene is two things simultaneously. It's a series of base pairs, and it's an inherited instruction for making proteins. And the category gene contains a contradiction there, and so do we as people. I'm concerned, though, that we cleave to the idea that we have some freedom, some autonomy, some capacity, and that our options and our way of thinking about ourselves don't get foreclosed. And that's not just about us as individuals losing some freedom or sense of our freedom or thinking less of ourselves. It's also about the way we conduct science and we investigate the world. It's, the people who wrote that popularization of big data, Meyer, Schoenberger and Cukier, say, we're going to have to let go of our obsession with causality. They can't wait to let go. They've already let go. They've stop, hang on to a little bit of causality there, hang on to some hypothesis-driven science. Don't let everything just be about looking for random associations with no causality and no hypotheses, because eventually that will be diminishing returns, mark my words.
Tim, as well as picking up audience things, would you like to delve a bit into this question of the scientific method? Is the scientific method basically big data with better computers?
Yeah, so this question that big data is a kind of, I think, Thomas talked about that proper trials, properly structured collections of people are better than big data. Well, actually, one thing about big data, which is a bit different, is because it's digital, as was pointed out, the collection method is digital. Constructing trials is a very long, slow process. And actually deriving statistics out of data the old way is also a long, slow process. Actually, frequently what you want is the analysis right now. And once you've got systems to collect big data in place, you tend to get it much faster than you would otherwise do. And that does bring direct benefits. So here's an example. Birmingham Hospital has this live system of data collection, rather than producing statistics months later, dashboards, and that allows them to track every individual patient. Did they get their antibiotic? Have they all got all the antibiotic treatments that they should have? You know, you'll get told you're meant to take this course for a particular time. It really makes a difference if you miss one out, or if you take one late, or if you take too many, or if you take too few, because it affects resistance. And we're very worried about resistance right now. And by tracking this much more carefully as a result of connectivity of data, they've been able to reduce their infection rates dramatically. So better using data directly in this live way, so you can spot, we used this during the Genome Project to spot, we have large production centers. It's a complicated process to sequence a piece of DNA. There's lots of places where it can go wrong. If you track it live, you can spot where things are going wrong and fix them in real time. And it's a similar sort of thing in hospitals. So live data, which comes as a result of collecting data on a large scale, gives you these additional benefits. That probably wasn't what I was meant to answer, but anyway.
No, well, no, I think that's part of it. It's part of this point from the audience. That it has big benefits for healthcare.
Yeah.
But in research, I mean, we do hear rumours that the hypothesis is dead, and in future science will be done directly by a machine with no hypothesis. Is that exaggerated? Is that
I think that
wrong?
There is this suggestion that you can't use data unless you have a hypothesis. Well, actually, there's an awful lot of things that you just don't think of if you discover them by accident. Computers can guide you. They can spot interesting correlations which you didn't expect. I've seen some results from Denmark where they were kind of tracking hospital outcomes and looking for correlations between them. And there were some very interesting dependencies with people who got seriously ill and what they previously were diagnosed as. Now, maybe those are misdiagnoses, or maybe that they're causative links between if you get diagnosed with this, you're more likely to come with this other thing, more serious things later. And these are the kind of things that we actually don't know because we haven't been able to mine this data before and spot these. And these things, and lots of non-obvious things that have come out of genetics linking diseases. So there's a fundamental thing saying, the definition of disease has come from doctors based on observation. They observe some symptoms, they draw up a question of disease. But underneath, there are mechanisms, there are actually molecular pathways that got broken, frequently because of genetics. There's a many-to-many relationship between that. So you can have a broken mechanism which could influence several different things, lead to several different diseases. There's a kind of remapping that needs to go on. Breast cancer isn't one disease. It's a whole range of different diseases, and they should be treated differently. And diagnosing, you need this underlying mechanistic data to say which is the right treatment for this individual.
So we're not throwing the hypothesis out, but the correlations can
Correlations
give us
suggest new
fruitful
things,
things.
and make it more individualizable.
Great. Okay, I'm going to come this way, then I will come back to you, Christine. Brian, would you like to pick up on any of these points?
I mean, just picking up on a couple of the points raised, I think people are individuals, and I do like that as a concept. I mean, previously we actually had to rely on individuals making judgments without data or information, or with only partial data or information. And what that led to was that people introduced their biases into those judgments made. So for example, the comment that, the people who aren't let out on parole may not have been bad people, but, when I'm faced with 5 individuals, each with their own biases, each with their own prejudices, and arguing the case that I should be let out on parole, well, which do I prefer, a more analytical approach or more bias and human approach? But I will argue that some combination of the two would probably be better than just solely relying on individuals who will capture within them their own moods, their own biases, their own tensions. Let's look at things which are actually real.
But is that not partly about what somebody in the audience raised about trying to trying to avoid risk and liability, and rather than the parole board being able to take responsibility and say, look, my professional judgment is this person is probably not ready and should stay in jail. This person is most likely ready to go out, and I will take responsibility for this decision. And instead of that, they've now got an algorithm, and the algorithm can take responsibility, and they go, well, we use the algorithm. It's the algorithm's fault if we're wrong.
I would say there's never the algorithm's fault if you haven't made a proper judgment. I mean, it's just like saying that if you were driving your car and you were following your sat-nav to 100%, and the road in front of you says no entry, flood, and you drive into the water, whose fault is it? Is it the sat-nav, or is it that you're stupid?
Thank you. It's a very vivid example. Martin,
That won't stop people trying to sue.
We have lawsuits in the United States about defense.
I want to pick up a couple of points. The first one is about consent and the fact that almost you can't avoid giving consent if you actually want to be able to operate online, for example. The consent that you give under those conditions is not informed consent. Those terms and conditions would never be enforceable in a British court of law. And the only barrier to actually suing companies that misuse data and then claim that you consented to it is that you can't afford to sue them. But class actions will in due course overcome that. And I predict that actually the issue of data consent and the way in which data is used is going to be one of the big mis-selling scandals of the future. And in the same way as we see major corporations being fined millions and, in fact, today billions of dollars for mis-selling things, misuse of data will turn out to carry the same level of penalties for major corporations in the future, and we can all look forward to getting some compensation as a result, in the way that the recovery in the UK seems to have been fuelled by the millions of pounds that have been pumped out in PPI claims from the banks. So there's something positive to look forward to, but the consent issue is not swept aside by the fact that you've ticked a box on a set of conditions that you never bothered to read because it was never going to be feasible to read them. The second thing I wanted to say is, yes, if big data is able to make predictions, why leave decisions in the hands of humans? A very good point that was raised at the back. And the answer is accountability. Clearly, you mustn't treat all big data. It's not one discussion we're having here. There are all kinds of uses of data, and they need to be treated differently in context. But where algorithms are constraining the actions of individuals, somebody needs to be able to be accountable for what exactly that algorithm contains that is leading to that decision. The algorithms need to be visible, and there needs to be some way of discerning the extent to which bias has been put into deriving the algorithms. It would be very easy for public policy to be driven by a political agenda, for example, through the means of influencing the algorithms that were then enforcing the sentences that judges laid down, rather than leaving judges to take much more nuanced decisions in the context of particular cases, or who was allowed through immigration controls, just to take a couple of examples where there are clearly differences in political stance that would be allowed to influence those decisions. So we need to take the opportunity we've got, I think, at this point in our history, following on exactly from what Brian was saying. We are where we are. We will, as a society, need to move forward to decide how we're going to control the way in which data influences our lives and the way in which algorithms influence our lives. And we need to be engaged in that debate now and making progress, rather than just putting up our hands and saying it's all over, it's too late, we can't do anything about it, we've got to suffer the consequences.
Thank you. if you're quick.
Well, just nice anecdote from your thing about accountability of algorithms. There's an urban myth that SimCity was tweaked under pressure from the auto manufacturers of the US because with the normal parameters, it looked like public transport was too good. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounds a good story.
I want to be on
but
one panel where Americans aren't criticized. Anyone? Anyone? No? All right.
Right, but the general thing about algorithms, actually this is an issue, a big issue in science. You know, you have big data, you have algorithms that run over that data, and you have publications, and you write publications and you have to review them and you read them afterwards and try and work out if it's right or not. It's harder and harder to do that. And so there's this movement of reproducible science that actually we've got to become much stricter in terms of making it possible to reproduce the science, which was, of course, always the purpose of a publication, to provide enough information to do that. So the ENCODE project, which I was involved in, tried to do that with their main publication. They actually released a virtual machine, links to all the data sets that were deposited. You can run the scripts in that to regenerate all the figures in the main paper. So you can actually play around and see what we actually did in that analysis. It was pretty hard to do, and it still, I'm sure, has bits which were not there because they were sub-analysis elsewhere. But it's that kind of effort we're going to need if we're going to be able to reproduce particularly these algorithms, and particularly if you use them for politics.
Okay, Christine, come back on whatever you...
Okay, so I think what Martin and Tim are saying is very important, and we should all, this is totally the take-home, whatever the hashtag for the, this tweet will be. It's already happening. So if you look at flash crashes on Wall Street, for example, there was this term that kept cropping up in the business press when I was reading about it, rogue algorithm. So already, it's this rogue algorithm. We don't know, it's gotten out of control, like the blob or something. And but a human being made this algorithm, and human beings are supposed to be monitoring how they are acting, didn't know what happened. And instead of saying, "Oh, we don't know, what a mess, you've just lost your life savings," they start talking about rogue algorithms because that's easier. I do want to get to the point which several people touched on in their questions when we say, I'm not my data, I'm an individual, I can make these choices. Martin was hinting about this in terms of consent, but you are your data when your data is a proxy for institutions to judge you by that. So you can't be an individual to the National Health Service in the same, if they're looking on mass scale. You're your own quirky self in the privacy of, your own home while you're, looking at cat videos on YouTube. But that isn't relevant to a lot of the institutions that have a serious impact on our daily lives, certainly on our politics and in the realm of health. So I think it's important to understand you are your data when your data is a proxy for who you are as a person in the 21st century. So it's important to make that distinction. The other thing is someone said, you sound fearful like Luddites, you're afraid of the, either the government or spies or corporations crushing you, and this sounds so fearful. I'm concerned, but I don't think I fear being crushed. I fear it's that, what's the metaphor of you put the frog in the pot and then you slowly turn up the heat and it begins to boil and finally it doesn't realize it's being boiled alive. The pot is simmering now, and we're starting to talk about this stuff, but think back, many 10 years ago when most people didn't walk around with cell phones. The only people who had cell phones were physicians and drug dealers, and this was the norm, and very quickly that norm was obliterated, and our behavior changed, and new fears and concerns were raised as well. Same thing with Google. I remember I had a friend who didn't have much of a presence on Google 5 or 6 years ago. A girl he wanted to date put his name into Google, and the scariest thing she found is that he wasn't on Google. That's a real transformation, right? I mean, he didn't exist, but that matters in terms of how we judge others and what individuality means in a world where you don't appear on Google. She thought he was a serial killer. So, so there are...
Not an ultra geek who kept himself...
No, or a crazy tinfoil hat wearing privacy nut. Either way, it was not going to turn out well for him. And he was something else entirely, but I'll protect his privacy on that. But I think, again, we're missing... all of these things are right. We're still our quirky selves. We can still put some data out there and hope to have control over it. But there is an environmental shift happening in terms of what we understand when we go out in the world, how much we expect to be watched and to be watched by others and to watch others. And there's this whole radical movement now of surveillance, S-O-U-S valence. I don't know if some of you have heard of it. This idea that, we can all, if the government's surveying us and institutions are surveying us, we'll just survey them back and then this will solve the problem. And it reminds me of okay, I will bring in a Wild West American metaphor of people both pointing their guns at each other. I mean, that doesn't solve this underlying problem, which is infrastructures. I hope my kids will one day grow up and become algorithmic auditors, which will likely be a job in the future, right? Where you send, just like you'd send a tax auditor in, you're going to have to send algorithmic auditors in.
So there is an element of this data discussion which hasn't really been touched on so much, and that's the way that people just are themselves creating huge amounts of data, which are just absolutely unprecedented. So the example which people may not have heard of is life logging, started in the 90s, where people just record, their life, put themselves online. But what's happened since then is in the research community, there's been a device which allows you can put around your neck and we'll take a photograph every 3 seconds. People have been using these things to just towards the goal of total capture, they sometimes call it, or total recall. And now, of course, if you're prepared to pay $1,500, you might be able to buy Google Glass, which means that you can stream, although they've turned this feature off at the moment, apparently, you can stream the totality of what you see as you walk around to the internet. You can, as I'm sure people know, it's a camera embedded in it, and this. So what I'm saying is that, so we've been talking a lot about what you might predict based on these very, particular kind of public stores of data. But actually, there is a huge incipient movement, or at least there's a huge technological potential that we will all just start recording amounts of data which are just unprecedented. It's already obviously embedded in our culture, because if you look at the way that people use Facebook and different picture services now, I've been yellow carded, so I better get off. So I just want to, so just look ahead a little bit more, because it seems that the terms of the debate so far have been framed very tightly around these about this stuff, and you've left out something very important.
I really agree with Brian, because the internet's already been around for so long, and people already had their website, their blog, on the internet for so long, and there's always been someone who keep all this data. And imagine if you are not on the internet, then you already submit your data to your employers, to someone. So the rest, even like the restaurant that you always have your lunch, your dinner, they have your data, like what you eat, what you have. And so maybe I think the question here, just to say, maybe we need to educate people about what really big data is about, so they actually understand about big data before they make complaints.
For Martin's almost original point, but I'm interested in everyone's viewpoint on privacy, because Martin, you gave quite a good defence of privacy, and sometimes you have got things to hide for fairly good reasons, but most of the ones you gave were kind of still fairly positive. So I wonder if, for instance, a predictive algorithm was going to predict that an individual or a population are basically racist, sexist, etc., do you still defend the right for privacy for those individuals anyway, as almost a negative thing? And also on a population level, say that the whole of the UK, or 50% of it, was deemed to be racist or something like that, then say a left-leaning journal might take that as meaning, well, we told you so, blah, 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 and then a right-leaning one might say, well, that's human nature, etc. So I wonder if there's anything that sort of comes out of that.
Okay, thank you.
I wonder if there's an instructive comparison to be made between the era of big data and the assumptions that are underlying that, and the assumptions that underlie the move in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s towards the ascendancy of rational choice and economistic models of mankind. And I think, so the most obvious one is that these assumptions become self-fulfilling. If you start to think of people as narrow units are only going to act in a very sort of way, people will tend to do that. And also that this, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was driven by the needs and rationality of the market. We needed to individualise people so they could become better consumers. And that's also, seems to me, what's happening today.
Okay, my problems with big data, when you listen to the discussion, is big data influence, big data decide, big data will tell us. And at the end of the day, big data or data on its own means nothing. It's really what we want to know with the data, how we analyze the data. And so I think we should put the discussion the other way around. And the problem for me with the big data is what we want to know today is not necessarily the good things. I mean, we may want to know if we get a disease, but why do we want to know just with the data that somebody may act as a criminal or not? And I think this is the discussion with the big data. It's not that it's a problem or not. It's what do we want to do and what do we want to know with the big data?
So it seems like through most of this discussion, we've sort of taken it as axiomatic that we can predict things in the future from recording historical data. And Hilary, I've forgotten her surname.
Salt.
Hilary Salt in the first session this morning made the distinction between projections based on past data by kind of maximum likelihood fit or whatever and actual prediction. And given through so many of the examples we've seen the distribution of the stuff we're recording is very fat-tailed. If you look at the example of people being advertised to based on just their gender and their age, there's so much variance in the data we're recording. Is there actually any predictive power at all in this, or is it are we overstating the case for there being predictive power in the data we're recording?
I've kept wanting to say I'm not. Everyone says yes, we're all individuals, but there we go. My point really is that big data does nothing. It's just data. The way we use it is a social question that's underlined by some of this discussion. But that's something that needs to be negotiated and constantly renegotiated. And similarly, the question that you asked, Tamandra, about the way, the way we think of ourselves as data points, does that lead to a deterministic view of what we are? I'd say no, it's completely the reverse. It's because we already have moved towards a deterministic view of what we are that we start thinking of big data in that way.
I agree entirely with Brian that data is just data, and really big data is a movement. It's a human movement. That's why it's got such a fancy name. And what we're really arguing with here is how we use that data. And people seem very concerned with the prejudices that come around from the algorithms that people come up with, but people are very capable of being prejudiced anyway. We don't need algorithms to do that. And one thing that I really picked up on in the talk was the point that was made about the parole system, where 70% of the time it was right, but 30% of the time it was wrong, and that was unacceptable. But my question would be then, what was the statistic from before, when it was just 5 people having a bad day, getting divorced, having a good day? What was their percentage? How correct were they on that? And I'd be willing to bet if we had big data then, we'd know. Whereas 70% sounds bad, but there's no comparative statistic there. So I was wondering if you know what it was.
So, yes, privacy applies to bad people too. I've spent a number of years as a director of the Serious Organised Crime Agency. I know a certain amount about bad people and what they do. But on balance, I'm left with the view privacy has to apply to bad people too. So even if the big data analysis would enable you to identify more bad people, you still need to maintain reasonable societal control over what people are doing processing data. The take-home messages I want you to go away with are just 2. The first is, don't trust anybody who says if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, because they haven't thought about it properly, or they are displaying some dreadful prejudices. And the second one is that anonymized personal data is an oxymoron. So anybody who tries to reassure you on that basis is lying to you.
On that note, Tim.
You've repeated the things you said at the first part, and as I said, I think that those can be got round by the system of safe havens, honest brokers, keeping not distributing data, having it anonymized, but again, not distributing it, controlling what's run on that, and that puts you in a much stronger position to protect the privacy of the individual. But I do think that one of the themes that's come up is accountability. Accountability of algorithms, they should be open so that you can check them. Accountability of consents, so you know what these consents really mean. Somebody's actually worked on them, interpreted what documents you've signed up to on all these websites, for example. And actually accountability of government. So this question about the guns aimed at both directions, actually I think it's been a big successful movement that's in progress. Governments releasing data and giving people a chance to look at that data and see what they're doing, which has really, Tony Blair famously said he thought the Freedom of Information Act was the worst thing he ever signed, which says something. I think that actually opening up government and allowing the people to get a way of investigating what's being done on their behalf, just in fact in health data terms as well, you having more control of data around you, not just relying on the doctors, these are valuable directions.
Thank you. Sandy.
I think the Freedom of Information Act was the worst thing Tony Blair ever signed. Christine pointed out that we are our data when institutions use our data as a proxy for us. true enough, and there are some circumstances in which it might be appropriate for organisations to use our data as a proxy for us. But there are many instances where it's not appropriate, and there are certainly political and healthcare authorities who, when they use our data as a proxy for ourselves, it's dehumanising, foreclosing, limited, lazy, cowardly, evasive of responsibility, and is likely to have poor consequences, and we need to fight against it and retain some latitude for individuality, idiosyncrasy, and qualities that are not reducible to quantities. I'm worried that although big data has an enormous amount of potential, rather than putting us at the centre of systems that maximise our conscious endeavours, it's subsuming us within them, and it's a recipe for reconciling ourselves to the world as it is. It's not what it pretends to be, which is a recipe for transforming the world, which is what we really need.
Thank you. Brian.
I will simply say that we are at the start of a journey which society has been through quite a number of times before. We need to actually accept and then come to agreement as to what is politically okay in these sets of circumstances. And this journey, we can't actually expect it to take place in the next 1 month, next 2 weeks. It will take us some time to set the rules, to reset ourselves until the next big thing comes along. But our data is out there, the information is out there, and we just need to accept that that's where we are and that's what's going to happen.
Thank you. Christine? You get the last word of the session.
Okay, I want to end with what Martin began with, which was just, if thrown out of context, it would gather twice this crowd, which is, he said big data was lazy, cheap, and attractive. So if that was our title, I think we would have had an even more engaged audience. But there's something about our technology and what fuels big data that does make us lazy, that allows us to sell our privacy cheap, but that we find wildly attractive. So I think it was a very good way of summarizing what we were talking about here. And I want to end with the future, and I'm glad that someone mentioned Google Glass, which I've spent some time using. It's very geeky and awkward, and the battery runs out, and it's strange, but it is the future. Wearable technology is the future. So what does this mean? Google isn't just the manufacturer of Google Glass. It is also making anticipatory algorithms like Google Now, which right now say, oh, you might want to leave 10 minutes early to catch your plane because traffic's really bad on the A4. But that is their foot in the door. They have much grander ambitions for what these anticipatory algorithms will use. All of this relies on big data and on us giving out a lot of our own information in exchange for convenience. So I think right now is the time where we have to start talking about regulatory frameworks within the context of individual states. It's going to be different here than it would be in the US, but we're not having enough of those conversations, so I'm glad we started today.
I hope you've enjoyed it. Do come back for the rest of the science session, and please thank our fantastic panel for a great discussion.